Hai, kia ora no tātou. Ka nui te mi ki autou ki o koutou te ahi ahi nei no reira. Tēnā koutou te whānau. E hui hui mai nei e raro te koro e o tātou. A riki e te wānei no reira koutou mā. Tēnā koutou. Te papatunuku o tēnei rohi tēnā koe. Tautoko mai tautoko. Ngā iwi tutahi o tēnei rohi a tēnā koutou. Pai rawa kiti e waini o tātou tēnei ahi ahi. Nō reira, i o koutou a ngā member o te tahuhu o te māturanga, tēnā koutou. Koutou mā, kia ora tātou. A hona e hao ki te mua, kia mua tautau, a koutou, ki te whakamaora ma te whakaora mai te kaupapa. Te kaupapa tino tata ki tōku manawa te wānei nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. I do speak English as well, so it's okay. I was just speaking to you in New Zealand Maori, talking about basically acknowledging your welcome and the Creator and the earth on which we stand, and thanking the First Nations of the area and all of you people for being here and welcoming me. And I was just saying that it's an honour to be here. And I'm very pleased and privileged to be able to talk with you. So thank you for welcoming me. Thanks to the Roots of Empathy team for their work, and to the ministry folk who are here and all others who are here as well. So thank you. That's what I was saying in Māori to you. It wasn't anything rude or anything, you know. So it was nice. So I'm very privileged to be here, and it's important. I'm always thrilled to be able to share things that we do in New Zealand with folk in Canada. We have a lot in common between New Zealand and Canada. We have relationships with larger neighbours that, like you folk do, that are always causing us sort of some issues and some problems, like beating our sports teams every now and then, you know, so that's one of the big issues we've got. I notice you folk have all those sort of issues as well. We're descended from many mixed groups of people. Many of us, like myself, descended from a mixture of the indigenous population and also, as you can see, from the populations of Europe as well. Many of us are like this, and and we also have big issues in common. That is, generally, the indigenous populations in our country are just overrepresented in the negative indicators of society's benefits, and underrepresented in the positive indicators of societies. That's the politest way of putting it out there. You know, 50% of our prison inmates are Maori, from a population of 13% in the population. That's just one indicator of it. Underemployment, unemployment, early school leaving, health, longevity, and so on and so on. Where all those indicators, we've got problems in them, in that area. What I'm really be able to report to you today is some of the successes that we've been able to have with education. And I'm delighted to be able to tell you that through being funded by the Ministry of Education for 15 years, I was able to develop a program that has seen really great gains in educational outcome for Māori students in terms of norm reference, standardised external examination tests, through to the more qualitative side, the well-being is your term, the well-being side of issues. So I want to talk about that. But first of all, how I'm going to structure the afternoon is this. It's going to be in 4 parts. After each part, I'm going to get you to have a talk with your colleagues, your neighbours, and I'll structure that a wee bit in a moment. I'm going to ask you to talk about, so what did this mean to you? What does your experience of listening to me talk mean to you? And those 2 questions, what is your experience and what does it mean to you, are the 2 questions that I've used for the last 25 years doing research with Indigenous people. It's got a flash it's a flash title, but it's a very simple activity. But what it's about is it's acknowledging the self-determination of people to create their own meanings out of their experiences. And it's fundamentally important to undertaking research and implementing pedagogies amongst Indigenous and marginalised populations. I'll go into that in more detail. So the first session, the first section I'm going to be dealing with is a series of vignettes. I'm going to tell you a number of stories, and what I'm going to do at the end of that is then say, okay, so what does this mean to you? I'm going to tell you some stories about my experiences of working with Indigenous students and educational achievement. We're all talking about how can we, the big question is, so how can we improve the educational outcomes for Indigenous and other marginalised students as well? Because what I've noticed and what I've found, and I've been to Europe and Canada and Australia and most of the first world countries that I've been into, and I've been into Malaysia more recently and into other Asian countries, and found that the circumstances of Indigenous populations are being replicated for refugee groups, migrant groups, other groups as well. They're having similar experiences of not being able to be successful, not being able to access the success that they would like to gain from our education system. And also I found that this is also very frustrating for their teachers and frustrating for the system level leaders like you folk. And it's a head scratcher. So let's start. First time I came to, well, one of the times I came to Canada, I was lucky enough to go out to Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands off the coast of British Columbia. And when I was there, and as I do every chance I do get, I talk with school principals. And I went into a school there and I said, and I always ask everybody I get my hands onto, I say, so how are the Indigenous kids going at your school? That's the first question. And then please, can you give me your explanation as to how it is? So I said, how are these kids going? And they said, oh, not very well. And so I said, well, tell me why, please. Again, not assuming that I understand why they're not going well. I am allowing the people to theorise their own experiences. Tell me, what's your theory? Explain this to me. And the principal said, it's because they suffer from depression. I said, oh, why is that? And the principal said, well, up here it's 3 months of the year it's dark, and people here don't get enough vitamin D, and it's a medically determined condition, and depression is the outcome of it. I said, oh, okay. How does it manifest itself at school? How would I recognise it? Well, she said it was the children are listless, they're bored, they have difficulty engaging in the lessons, they can't look at the teacher, they can't talk to the teacher, and they absent themselves from schooling a lot. I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting, that's good. So I was lucky enough to actually have met the native assistant at another school, and I went back and I saw Tyler, who was this guy, a native assistant from the Haida Gwaii area. And I said to him, I was just talking about it generally, I said, so how long have your people lived in Haida Gwaii? He said, oh, send me the anthropologists tell it's about 12,000 years that we've lived here. I said, oh, okay. Have your people been depressed for 12,000 years, have you? And he said, no. I said, well, when did the depression start? He said, in 1769. I said, the same guy visited our shores around that time too. How interesting. That's the first story. Second story. I go inland and I go to the Peace River area in British Columbia. Some of you might know the area. Beautiful place, plains heading up into the Rockies, right? So and as I'm wont to do, I say to the principal there, how are your children getting on here? How are your Indigenous children? Mostly Indigenous kids at this school. Oh, not very well. Oh, why is that? You know, being respectful, asking the question. What's your theory behind this? He said, oh, they suffer from fetal alcohol effects. I said, oh, tell me, is this, I've heard of this fetal alcohol syndrome. He said, no, it's not fetal alcohol syndrome. That's a medically determined condition. This is the fetal alcohol effects that are similar to the syndrome, but it's what we as educators have identified as being the conditions that these children come to school with. And this is what I said, okay, so what are the symptoms of this fetal alcohol effects? He said, well, it's listlessness and boredom, an inability to concentrate and engage with the teacher, and high absenteeism. I said, oh, I've come across this before out there. And I said, so tell me more about it. What proportion of your students are suffering from this? Because seemingly, I don't know, you'll know the stats better than me, but there's about 5% of fetal alcohol syndrome or something. And he said, well, sometimes we have a whole class will be suffering from this, fetal alcohol effects. At least 50% of every class are suffering from it. So I said, well, gee, that's okay. So I was lucky enough the next day, on the Monday, I went to a classroom. And I was standing in the classroom, and the teacher was teaching. I'd also said, what sort of pedagogy do you use with these children to cope with this, to handle this, these effects, you know? And so he said, you're best to go and have a look in a classroom. So I go to a classroom on the Monday morning. There's a whole bunch of Indigenous kids in the class. The teacher's at the front of the room, whiteboard, and it's got some sentences written up on the board, and he's teaching subjects and predicates. And he explained to me that this is remedial work because these children didn't understand it from the previous year. And he was going through with a whiteboard marker and identifying the subjects and the predicates, and the children were writing it down. After about a quarter of an hour of this, I went up to my colleague and I said, I think this fetal alcohol effects might be contagious. Because I was feeling listless and bored, and I was having difficulty interacting with the teacher, and I wanted to get the heck out of there. I wanted to be absent myself from that place because it was oppressive. I just found it, I couldn't cope. So the kids were handling it better than I was, I must admit. I wanted to get out after a quarter of an hour. They were staying on. So that's the second of the stories. And the third one was, hang on, let me just I've got the order. The order is important. Oh, yeah. The third one, I go to Utah with a colleague of mine from, from Canada here. And I go to Monument Valley into a high school there which is set up for Indigenous children. And I'm introduced and I'm welcomed into the school and everything. And the first chance I get, I say to the principal, well, how are the Indigenous students going in this school? And they say, well, not very well. Oh, okay. How come? They suffer from passive-aggressive syndrome. I said, oh, how's that? What are the symptoms of the passive-aggressive syndrome? Well, they're listless and they're bored, and I've heard this before. In fact, I've even had it. I know this syndrome. I've had this syndrome. And I said, so how do you cope with it? What do you do with it? And he said, we have a cultural revitalisation enrichment program, particularly for the boys. What we do is they can't sit still in the classroom, and so we get them out. They don't do maths and stuff. We do a cultural program. We're out the back and they're building, these were Navajo Dene people, and they're building hogans out the back, and not out the front of the school, mind you, they're out the back, and they're building these hogans, and they're doing all sorts of ceremonial things, and we have community relationships, it's very good, and the community comes in and helps us with this material out the back, these cultural activities out the back. That's the third one. The fourth example, the fourth vignette, is I go to, again in Peace River, I go to a high school, and I'm introduced to the school principal, and I'd met the principal before and we were chatting away, and I said, how are the kids getting on at your school? And he said, not very well. And I said, okay. And he said, let's have a look. Can I go to a classroom? And I always like to get into a classroom, and I was introduced and welcomed into this classroom, and there was a young woman teacher in her first year of teaching there, and I sat in the classroom, and she was teaching a subject which I'm pretty keen on. I used to be a social studies teacher in high school when I was about 100 years ago when I was younger, and the topic was climate change and its impact upon humans. I thought it was pretty good. And there was a native assistant in the classroom, and it was all going well, looked pretty good. And then the method the teacher was using, the pedagogy the teacher was using, was a PowerPoint with bullet points based on, what's his name, that guy, Gore, Al Gore's book and movie. And so she went through these slowly, pointing out to them the major points that were there, and then she showed them a video of Al Gore talking. The native assistant's job seemed to me to be to go around and wake up the native kids who were in the classroom, because they had actually gone to sleep. And they were, one particular girl down the back, I was observing her closely, and her head was down the desk, and it seemed to me that the native assistant, their main task was to go in there and wake the kids up and say, pay attention. The rest of the kids, mind you, were actually doing this under the desk with the cell phones, texting to places and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't any behavioural issues, it was just non-engagement, complete. Now the fifth point, the fifth vignette, is a primary school I went to, an elementary school I went to in Peace River South as well. And I went and I spoke with the principal at the school and said, I missed the point. When I asked the school principal what were the major features of the children in that school, was listlessness and boredom and inability to concentrate and high absenteeism. The same syndrome. I go to an elementary classroom and I talk to the teacher, the school principal beforehand, and I asked them, how are the Indigenous kids going at this school? And she said they're going fine. They're achieving at the same level as the non-Indigenous kids. Their absenteeism is the same as the non-Indigenous kids, the usual coughs and colds and winter ailments, etc. We have pretty good relationships with the local community. In fact, if there's any issues in the local community, we go there and we show them support and participate, and we go out and talk to them quite a lot. And if they wish to come to the school, then they are there quite a lot, etc. And I then went into a classroom, and she talked about how important it was to support teachers and work in teams. And it was in the secondary school, the young woman was an isolate. And I saw a young woman teaching in the primary school, and she was part of a collective. And I watched a class, I went into a classroom, and they were doing an activity which I recognised as expert jigsaw, which is a cooperative learning strategy, which has been around for, since Adam was a cowboy, I think. It's a long time ago, old stuff. And this was working beautifully. There was a whole bunch of kids. There were Indigenous kids mixed in through the class, and they were fully engaged. Each, the expert jigsaw, there's 4 groups, 4 people in a group, and there's a task organizer and a recorder and a participant organizer and a critical friend, to sort of, and everybody's got a task, and highly sophisticated pedagogy, and everybody was engaged, everybody was going to town. It was having a good time. In fact, and in the high school classroom, the kids didn't want to know me, didn't want to look at me. And in fact, when I spoke with the teacher afterwards about the lesson, she burst into tears, which didn't help my demeanour much, or didn't help her at all either. But this time, this young woman was particularly happy to see me and welcome me in. In fact, the kids were delighted. They wanted me to sit down and participate with them, etc., etc. And interestingly enough, the kids in the primary and the elementary school were the siblings of the children in the secondary school. Now, you might just say it's primary where they teach children and secondary where they teach subjects. You might just say that's it. There's more to it than that, as you will imagine. The sixth vignette is some work that I did myself in New Zealand in 2003. And it was to find out actually, what's it like to be a Maori student in a secondary school? What's it like to be there? So instead of asking, we asked the principals, and we asked their families, and we asked their teachers. We also asked, most importantly, the young people themselves. And we said, so how are you getting on at school? Those same questions. And why is that the case? I asked exactly the same. Myself and a team of people, we went out and we just did the old pattern snowballing approach until we found until we started getting the same story, and we interviewed enough people to realise that we were getting a common picture. I've done this exercise in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, and some colleagues of mine have done it in Malaysia. And I thought to myself, how on earth are these folk in Malaysia going to do it? And each time we've got exactly the same pattern. Let me show you the pattern of what it looked like. I did a frequency count of ideas, of units of ideas that people had used when they were explaining their experiences. So again, looking at the theorising of people. What is the theory that's driving their practice or their understanding of it all, okay? Theory is absolutely vital because, as Jerome Brunner told us many years ago in that wonderful book, The Culture of Education, 1996, he was talking very clearly in there about theory has a major impact upon your practice. The theory you hold of people influences, in fact, determines your practice. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, put it even more clearly when he said, it's the discourses or the language that you use that will illustrate the sort of theory that you have and the practice that will come from that theory. So in other words, if you're drawing upon a negative discourse, these discourses exist in society. People don't make them up. They're there. They're sets of languages and ideas that have existed since colonial times. So if they're negative discourses that people are drawing upon, generally their practices will be negative. So, for example, if you think that people are slow and need to be, if they can't handle things, you do remedial work with them, etc. If you think they're intelligent human beings, you give them a whole lot of fast stuff. What we found when we talked to people, we found that they drew upon three sets of ideas, three of these discourses. And they either said, so how's it getting on? What do you like? What's it like at school? How are you getting on? And what's causing it? And they generally drew upon, either they said it was the child that had the biggest impact upon educational achievement, or it was the structure of the school, or it was the relationship between the teachers and the students, or between the school and the parents, or whatever. The students told us this. 80% of the unit ideas that the students drew upon were from that discourse, the relational discourse. They said, and you know this yourself, they said, we go to classes that we like the teacher in. What's your favourite subject? It's math. Why is it math? We love the teacher. We get on well with the teacher. And because the teachers are kind to us, they're good to us, they care for us, and we know, and most of all, we know we're going to do well in that class. I spoke to some young girls one time after a maths class, and I said that the teacher had said to them, I'm not going to teach you anything today, because he said, I'm going to use a cooperative learning strategy where you're going to do the teaching, think, pair, share. And they said, darn it, this is so important, this class. We learned 3 new things in this class every day. They were really excited to get there. And so they said that's what it was. They acknowledged that they sometimes themselves were problems. They acknowledged that the structure of the school, the bells and then there's the secondary schools where the bells go all the time and you're constantly having to move around. And they said that basically it's the relationship. Their families told us it was the same pattern. And the school principals and deputy principals told us it was the same pattern as well. We said to them, so okay, we know you've got, as school principals, we know you've got problems with, the roofs leaking and the toilet paper and all that sort of stuff, really important stuff. But what's the biggest impact upon the achievement levels of the kids in your school? And they said it's the relationship between the teacher and the student. And then we asked the teachers. And what did they say? That's a question, not a rhetorical question. What did they say? Sorry? Exactly. Primarily the child, and then if it wasn't the child, they said it was the structure. There's 20% of the ideas, mind you, where people are actually doing well, are actually in the relational discourse. And it's interesting that they were having, we then said, how are the kids in your class going? Fine. And they said, fine. And then we said to the people in the left-hand column, how are the children in your class? Well, they're listless, they're bored, they're lacking in engagement, and they absent themselves a lot. Same pattern. And then we said to the teachers and the kids and everybody, so what can you do about this? And the teachers primarily said to us, well, what can you do about it? What can we do about it? I mean, it's difficult to change people, and it's very difficult to change these students because they've got all sorts of problems. Their parents don't care about education. They let them stay up all night watching violent videos. They are into drugs and alcohol. There's every problem under the sun, and they can't do well. And we can't do anything about it. And they told us how frustrated and angry and upset they were that they couldn't do anything about it. And then the people in the structural area said, well, what can you do? If there's one thing in the world that hasn't changed since World War II, it's secondary schools. Secondary schools, I mean, we've been through all sorts of new reforms in our country. We don't even have post office anymore. We don't have anything. Everything's been closed down and privatised and changed. And, you know, we have railways that run by a Canadian company for a while there. I won't tell you what happened to that. It didn't work out. But our secondary schools are still the same. In fact, I made a mistake one year of saying that when I was talking about this to a group, I said, I found something that actually is similar to, that could withstand direct nuclear attack. And it's mostly secondary schools. Because I said this, that I said, I reckon that if there was a nuclear attack on your average secondary school on a Friday afternoon, by Monday morning, the place would be all going again, and the bells would be ringing, and there would be, you know, the notices would be going out, and teachers would be writing on the whiteboards, you know. And I made a mistake of saying that, of course. And another time I said, look, I found another thing. You know the thing that does, what survives through nuclear attack? What is the one thing? It's cockroaches, right? And I said, I found another thing that would survive nuclear attack. I never say that now because I got a growling. Somebody came up to me and said, are you comparing secondary schools to cockroaches now? I said, no. I was just giving an example. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that anymore. I'm not telling you now, so please don't give me a hard time about cockroaches and stuff, you know. But what's interesting about this, of course, is that the people who are drawing on the child discourse feel frustrated, angry and upset. The people who are in the relational discourse, when we asked them, and this included 12 to 14 to 15-year-old young Maori people, and we said, so what could you do about it? They gave us this great big list of things that you can do. And basically what they said is, and we said to them, if we could coach your teachers to make a difference for you and your peer group, what would you say to them? And they said, this is what we would ask you to do. I'm paraphrasing, I'm summarising, but they said, what would be really cool would be if they actually showed that they cared for us, if they had high expectations for us, if they managed the learning so that we could actually get on and learn, and that we knew in that room that we were going to be able to learn and succeed. Because that's where we go. We go to those classes now where we know these things. So it's not as if they didn't have examples of it. So it's not all bad. It's just pretty bad. And they also said, we also want to be able to interact with people. we've got good ideas too, you know. We want to be able to actually bring our ideas forth and interact with other people. These kids had heard more about Vygotsky, for example, than the teachers had. Because the teachers had been filled, their heads had been filled at their previous education institutions with whole lots of notions drawn from neo-Marxist theorising, which says you can't do much until you wait for the revolution. You've actually got to change the whole structure of schooling. In fact, you need to change the whole structure of society. And we've still got people in our universities that are talking like that. My only answer to them is, when's this going to happen? And they haven't quite happened yet. I haven't got time to wait for that. A colleague of mine did one of the colleagues that did the research with me in 2003 then went back in 2016 and spoke with 158 successful engaged Maori students at high schools and said to them, how's it going now at school for you 15 years later? And they said, essentially they said that the school environment where their own culture and values are explicitly celebrated, modelled and thus made more acceptable, was very helpful for them. And I thought, oh, okay, that's what they were trying to do at the school in the Navajo school. They had this cultural celebration model. Then, however, they went on for a bit further and they said, however, their peers, their family and their friends, that is, those who are non-engaged in what the school is doing, which is by far the biggest group, were not able to overcome the barriers and were not achieving the success that is an expected outcome of school. So still the vast majority of children, despite the best efforts of these schools, and despite the cultural celebration models that are becoming very dominant in our country at the moment, the kids aren't doing well at the school. So how do we sort this out? How can we sort this out? And we can see, for example, that the theories that people have has a big impact upon their practice. And we also can see, for example, that the practice is all over the place. There's no common code of practice. There's no common theories about this stuff. It seems to me that people have a theory that is drawn from whatever they have been coming across in their previous education. There doesn't seem to be any great leadership in theorising about, for an explanation about Indigenous children and their experiences at school. And then I thought, okay, well look, there must be something in the research literature that will tell us about a common code of practice, about how we might go about things. You go to a doctor, for example, a medical doctor, and you'll find that their practices are pretty consistent. And in fact, they're constantly updating their practices, and they are consistent and persistent. And they've got a means of doing so, which is called a scientific method, where they have blind reviews and they do experiments and they have 50 students or 50 people in a case and a sample and all that sort of stuff. They've got means of actually working out if things are going to be, if things will work and if things, you understand what I mean, don't you? Right. If you go and present yourself with an appendicitis, then they'll probably do an appendectomy, and they'll probably do the appendectomy from which side? From the front, right, wherever it is. And there'll be a way they'll do it. There's hygiene things, and they'll talk to you about it, and there's processes and procedures, and these processes and procedures have been worked out and they're written up in the literature. Okay. In education, yet we have our education system is incredibly responsive to politicians. And politicians have ideas about education. For example, we've had, in the last 20 years, I noticed we've had personalised learning, we've had child-centred education, we've had voucher systems proposed, we've had, currently we've got one where all the professional learning funding has been decentralised to the schools because they know what's best to do. And then the next government that's getting in says they're going to bring it all back into the centre and give it out again, and all this sort of stuff. And this all comes from the politicians. And I'm wondering if we had a medical Minister of Health who said, I've got a good idea about appendectomies. Instead of doing it the way you think you should be doing it, I think we could do it if they stood up and you did it from the back. It could be quicker, and it would save a lot of money. Now imagine what the medical profession would say to the Minister of Health about that. And yet we as educators seem to do things that are crazy. And then I thought, okay, well look, let's look at the education journals and see where we can find out how we might go about improving the educational outcomes of Indigenous students and students in general. And luckily, Christine Sleater, professor at Monterey Bay in California, has done it for us. In 2012, she researched the top education and professional development journals, 4 leading teacher education, in-service, pre-service journals, and she identified 196 articles that were about improving student outcomes. Okay? 11 of them actually reported student outcomes. 196 take away 11 as 185 articles had no evidence whatsoever of any impact upon student outcomes. They were good ideas. That's all they were. It was good ideas that somebody had had. They might have tried it out, but there was no evidence in those 185 articles. And what's even worse is that of the 11 articles, only 2 were actually large-scale mixed method studies that you could replicate in another setting. So we're our own enemies. We're allowing good ideas to dominate, and good ideas is inverted commas, by the way. We're allowing good ideas to dominate, and we are not using any replicable scientific approaches to understand how we can do things. And I'm just going to talk about this. The need for a theory that actually resonates with marginalised peoples, that actually is useful, as opposed to giving us blockages. Where I got the theory that I'm talking about was from my mother's family, and here we are. That's my great-grandmother, or one of my great-grandparents, and her son, one of her 13 children, was, 16 children she had eventually, 2 husbands, 1 drowned, is this my grandfather. And here he is at age 80 with his sister at a little town outside in southern New Zealand. And they were part of a great dispersal that took place in this family. And there's whole lots of stories I can tell you about the family, how they split up. Some married Pākehā people, Europeans, some married Maori, and one of the greatest, and I did this big study on it, and what it showed me, and I also did another study, this is 20, 30 years ago when I did this stuff, and what it showed me was that if you wanted to work with a group of folk like this, that you needed to establish an extended family-like relationship. I won't go into great detail of how come I found that out, but basically I was told by the participants using Maori research approaches, that is, using Maori cultural approaches, that I learned by listening, and I had to listen because the people who I was working with are older than myself, so there was that dimension. And they told me very carefully that you need to work. We are happy about you benefiting from this, but we don't want you to do what Western researchers normally do, or university-trained researchers normally do, and that is they collect data and they take it away and they analyse it themselves and they benefit from it, and we don't benefit from it. So therefore they taught me about who benefits from research. They taught me about the initial questioning. The questions that you ask will determine the outcomes. They taught me about the link between theory and practice. They taught me about how you represent people. With what authority have you got when you paint pictures or word pictures of people? What authority have you got to do that? Are you doing that with them, or are you doing it on them? And they also taught me about the importance of accountability. I then took that into a doctoral study I did and looked at other people who were working, and I found that they likewise established family-like relationships when they were undertaking research in Maori settings. Maori people understood, it resonates with Maori. There are ways of knowing, there are ways of understanding that are understood through in Maori cultural practices. I then extrapolated that into classrooms and said, I'll come back to this slide in a minute. I just want to introduce it a bit. I then said, okay, what would that look like if we practiced it and we had classrooms that were developed as if they were extended families? And the characteristics of extended families is high levels of care, these ideal type families, high levels of care, high levels of expectation, high levels of interaction, high levels of you name it. So interactions, care, management, expectations, and so on and so forth. What would it be like, what would it look like, etc., etc. And so we then, on the basis of that theorising, developed a program called Te Kotahitanga in New Zealand. The word Te Kotahitanga means the unity of purpose. Let's get together and sort this out. Let's get everybody together and sort it out. And so let's not discard people, and that includes teachers and parents and children. Let's not discard people. Let's get everybody together and let's get a purposeful coaching program going. And so Te Kotahitanga involved a purposeful coaching of teachers to support the learning of their students, as opposed to being at loggerheads with their students. And the outcome of it is shown in this graph. What we did was, as part of the coaching process, we did some observations and gathered this data for formative purposes as well as summative. Here's the summative purposes of the data. And what we've got there is, on the scatter plot, 3,500 observations over 3 time periods in 1 year. No, over 3 years and 3 time periods during that time. There are 1,250 teachers, and so the chances of this happening by chance are almost nil. So it's statistically significant data is what I'm getting at. And if you look at along the bottom, along the horizontal graph, we've got there a measure of relationality. It's a weighted, it's a Likert scale measured relationality, looking at such things as how well is the teacher demonstrating on a daily basis that they care for the kids? Are the teachers demonstrating that they have high expectations? Are they managing learning effectively? Do they know what they're teaching? Do they have knowledge of what they're actually on about? And are they actually demonstrating that they are not resorting to deficit thinking? The deficit thinking has been, we identified as being the major impediment to teachers, because we'd say to teachers in those interviews, so how are kids getting on? Not very well. Why not? They don't care. What impact does that have on your teaching? Well, I don't care. What can I do? I put the stuff out there, they don't care. So on, downward spirals. So deficit notions, we were looking at that. That's what that constitutes. The vertical axis is actually those pedagogies that we know make a difference for educational outcome. You want to improve educational outcome, you use students' prior knowledge. Research has shown us that 50% of everything that teachers try to teach to kids, they already know. So why don't you ask them what they know before you start teaching? It'll save yourself 50% of your time, on average. Then the second thing is, do you provide feedback on their learning? Do you provide feed forward? Do you say where is this going to take you to? Where do you go to next? And then, most importantly, are they actually allowing students to co-construct knowledge and co-construct learning as they're going through? It's a sociocultural approach. We know all this sort of stuff. We know from John Hattie's work and all these meta-analyses that are around that this is the stuff that makes the difference. Stand and deliver does not actually make any difference. People do not learn through what I'm doing now. There's always an irony. There always has to be an irony in everything you're doing. So there is, this won't change practice. This does not change practice. What changes practice is feedback on your practice and a co-construction of where you might go to the future. I've got data to show that as well. And so what this graph shows us is that, first, before I say that, what's interesting about professional learning opportunities provided for learners is that often, for teachers that is, we do the vertical axis. We do the feedback, the feed forward, show teachers how to do this sort of stuff. And yet, and they go into classrooms with a lot of Indigenous kids and it doesn't work. And they don't know why. And I'll show you why. It's because they haven't got a relational base. This is why this is called relationship-based teaching, relationship-based pedagogy. Now, what you've got there is this vertical and the horizontal. You've got a correlation between the two. You can see that, eh? As teachers get better at developing relationships with the students, they are more able to use those pedagogies that we know are effective. Okay? And it's a 0.4 correlation. It's not that high a correlation, but it's reasonable. But it does give us an indication that there are too many people. Oh, I know what I've got here. There are a lot of people in this, in the bottom right-hand quadrant, a lot of people. Now, our job as educators would be to coach those people to move up to the northeast quadrant. You with me? So data is very useful. Where are we going to go from here? Formative use of data. This is what has us out what we would learn from this. But what's really interesting about that top left-hand quadrant, remember there's 3,500 observations over 3 years at 3 time periods at each year and 1,250 teachers involved in this. And look at the top left-hand quadrant. What does that tell you? There's not one observation in that quadrant. In other words, those teachers that have low levels of relational skills do not use, and I would suggest cannot use, those pedagogies that we know make a difference for children's learning. Isn't that fascinating? And I'll tell you the next thing, is that when you look at the probability of that happening, it's exponential. It's not one-to-one. In other words, as people get better at the skill level of developing relationships in a classroom, that is, non-deficit thinking, non-deficit talk, you can't do this sort of stuff, some teachers will say. Your sister was here last year and she was a pain in the neck, I expect you to be the same. We've got records of people saying this to children, in case you're wondering if I'm making it up. Caring, high expectations, high levels of management, and knowing what to teach. Those are the 5 dimensions that if you want to make a difference, you want to develop relationality in a classroom, they are the vital dimensions that need to be coached. Teachers need to be coached to learn these things. Anybody can learn them. It's not rocket science. It's not impossible to learn. But if you look at that, what's happening there, the relationality, as it increases, so does the ability of people to use those pedagogies we know make a difference. Using children's prior knowledge, feedback, feed forward, co-construction. They're what makes a difference. And we've got the effect sizes on all of those are well over 0.72 in Hattie's charts. And relationality itself provides a 0.72 outcome. You add those other 4 into it, you add the other dimensions into it, and you're getting over 1.1, 1.2 effect sizes. So the results of this stuff are really profound for children's learning. And we're seeing this in the Northern Territories, in Australia at the moment. Aboriginal kids that have been, where the history of Aboriginality, of Aboriginal education has been pileless. And now we're seeing children changing. And teachers are now changing too, and they're saying, oh, these kids can learn after all. Hey, look at this. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it spirals up. Instead of spiraling down, it spirals up. So you can see there that it's exponential, the growth. The other thing I'm always fascinated in is how engaged are students. And you can see here as relationality measures improve from left to right, so does student engagement improve. Again, in the The top left-hand quadrant, you've got low levels of student engagement with low levels, correlated with low levels of relationality. And in the bottom right-hand corner, this time, you've got high levels of relationality and nobody not engaged. Everybody's engaged. And there, the probability of that happening is the same. It's an exponential. So it's relationship-based. What this shows you is that statistically, if you get an exponential curve like that, it means that one precedes the other. One determines the other. If it's straight up and down, there are correlations. But this way, one determines the other. So the relationality determines the engagement and the ability to use effective pedagogies. There, in a nutshell, is the reason why Indigenous kids aren't doing well in mainstream schools, is because we put the cart before the horse. We don't actually deal with the relationality, and if we do deal with relationality, we water it all down so that it becomes holding hands and singing Kumbaya and being nice to people. It's not being nice, it's creating a learning context as if it were an extended family context in a classroom. And from that, you will then be able to develop, as we've shown here, you can then develop effective pedagogies, effective classroom contexts, and effective outcomes for Indigenous students. And you can see here the two graphs. The red is Maori, the grey is, no, sorry, the other way around. The red is non-Maori and the grey is, no, red's Maori, grey non-Maori. And you can see that as people get better at implementing relationships in their classrooms, Maori students do better at norm-reference standardised tests. These are ASTIL tests, they're norm-reference, standardised, what any student has to achieve at. And as you can see there, as kids get better, as the teacher gets better at relationships, their kids do better in maths. You want to improve maths? Here's how to do it. Don't get involved like we did in our country and spent $44 million on maths programs. And what happened over the 10, 15 years of the maths programs that we instituted?
We beat you, we're at 60 million.
Well, okay, we're a bit more hard up. There's not so many people either, you know. Hey, listen, this city we're in now's got more people than our country, for crying out loud, you know. But the gains made by Indigenous and marginalised students, and by most students, by the way, unfortunately, over the 10-year period is summarised in that figure, 0. And part of and I would suggest that the reason why is because of that. We didn't attend to relationality. We didn't attend to relationality in the classrooms. And the effect size, as you can see there, is 0.35. In other words, those teachers who are not attending to relationality in their classroom, are not creating a family-like context in their classroom, are seeing children. 0.35 just means that children will get that by any means. 0.4 is pretty much, you'll get there, just maturation does that. So the kids model will have stayed at home for that in those classrooms. Whereas in the other classrooms, you're getting 0.63 in the top two groups. 0.63, which is a medium to high effect size, as you'll know. Non-Maori did better. There's good questions there. You might like to talk about that later. And also, and the other thing we found is that in the first, this happened early on in the program, and it happened time after time after time, and that you can see there that New Zealand Māori and Pacific Island kids who do the same, who have the same appalling educational outcomes as New Zealand Māori, you'll see them there, that the gains made from 2005 to 6 are much greater than any other groups. Got that much more to catch up. 5, done. I'm going to now show you a short clip. And you see this stuff that one of those reports that Christine Sleater reported on in her research, which said that you had to have outcome measures that showed results for students based upon what you could do to make a difference, is this article here. So it's American Education Research Journal. So this is where we need to aim. This is the third top journal in the world, and we need to get Indigenous examples into these journals to show people that this is really where you can use this stuff with confidence, knowing that you'll get good results. And we've got results from Peace River showing moving from graduation of children from 28% graduation rates to 82% graduation rates over a 5-year period. I'll come to some more results later on. What I'm going to show you now is a teacher in action, a teacher putting into action a relational pedagogy. Okay? It's 8 minutes long. Okay? You happy to watch that?
Morena class.
Here we go.
Kete peha koe. Now, how was Mrs. Kurana's pronunciation today? 8 out of 10. Oh, that's not good. Okay. Do you know how to greet in my language? Namaste. Namaste. Oh, very good. Excellent. Okay, now in this lesson today, we have finished with our statistics.
This group of Year 10 maths students at Whakatane High School are something of a model class. The students certainly appreciate their teacher and the progress they're making.
This may sound a bit cheesy, but some of us wish that all of our teachers were like Miss Crown, because she explains everything so well and goes over it until the whole class knows it.
She cares about our learning. Yeah. And she don't just write it on the board, like she explains to us and makes us get it easily. Well, to the other teachers, they just write it on the board and just leave it and then let us do the work, and we don't even know what to do.
We all know our work, and we've come up like 2.5 levels since the beginning of this year. We're level 3 now, we're doing level 5/6, I think.
And one more comparative graph.
Composite.
Yes, the one Mrs. Kurana hasn't written well at all, isn't it? What marks do I get for this writing? 2 out of 10. Okay.
The classroom wasn't such a happy place when teacher Anjali Kurana first met his students at the beginning of the year.
Originally, I come from India, but I've been in New Zealand for the last 16 years. All these years I was teaching in South Island, and then we moved up here. And my experience, when I started teaching at Whakatane High School, I thought I was teaching in another country. That's how different it was from teaching in South Island compared to here. The reason being more Maori students here. And I started teaching the way I've been teaching all along. And that's when I realized things weren't going right in my classroom. I was absolutely stressed. The kids were giving me a very, very hard time.
We thought she was a snobby lady that just immigrated from India. Nah, we were all naughty at the beginning of the year. We didn't know Miss. We sort of judged a book by its cover. And like heaps of people used to wag at the beginning of the year.
I had actually gone and voluntarily given it to them without asking them, had you actually first asked each other?
Anjali sought guidance and support from the Kotahitanga facilitator, Haida Wallace.
She came and approached me and talked to me about some of the problems that were going on. And yeah, she was quite upset and ready to throw the class away. And in fact, talking about throwing teaching away.
Instead of feeling happy, these kids were coming in my room. I already had apprehensions that the class wasn't going to go okay for me. I didn't like teaching them at all. I even came out of class one day crying. And that's when Hiria stepped in and I talked to her. And she came to observe a lesson, what I was doing wrong. And that's when, after the lesson, we sat together and it was like a feedback session to me. Things that she wanted changed in the classroom.
She was prepared to do anything, any little thing that would help change the situation that she currently had. And in some ways she was quite traditional in that she did stay at the board for quite a long time.
when I was on the board trying to explain things, I was doing too much of explanation, and the students after 10 minutes were bored listening to me. So the whole topic had to be broken up into small segments, and I was to teach them just one little thing at a time.
Haida encouraged Anjali to move the students into cooperative groups, encouraging them to consolidate their understandings before advancing.
That's when my handwritten worksheets went out, and they would sit and help each other in a group.
You plus them, and then you get your answer. And then you divide by 2.
They were only supposed to take my help if all 4 or 3 of them couldn't solve the problem. So here I became a person in the background for a while they were trying to work out the problem within themselves.
Oh, you gotta find the most common number, and then like if there's 214, that's the most common number.
So is that the mode?
Yeah.
We actually learn more as a group because we have other kids in our group that know a bit more than us.
And that one there that has no other numbers that are like it, so if there was another 14 that would be the median, or the mode, sorry, but it doesn't have one, so it'll be no mode, but you can't write 0 mode because that's not the answer, it's just no mode.
Yeah. Okay.
Haida also spoke directly to the students to ensure they understood that their teacher was trying hard to adapt her teaching methods to more closely meet their needs.
Yeah, just talked about how when they're working in groups, how they can help each other and how they can use their skills and knowledge together, and that the teacher would be trying out different things with them, maybe stuff that they hadn't tried before.
The next thing suggested by Haida was that they need an instant feedback on how they have progressed on that worksheet. So an answer sheet was prepared where I had a complete working of the sum so that they exactly knew where they had gone wrong, if they had gone wrong. I had to build up those relationships. That's how the Maori students were going to work. I had to make that effort of coming and meeting them more than halfway. I think the relation building exercise became much more dominant in my mind, that I had to really make a very good effort to have that good working relationship with my student. And those little things suggested by Haida of the 2 cultures coming together, that was a very positive thing. After every test we would celebrate it, where I would cook something from my culture, they would bring something from there, and we would sit and we would have it together.
That relationship would extend outside of school hours, with students and their parents sometimes receiving phone calls from Mrs. Kurana.
She left a message on my phone saying, "This is Miss Kurana, remember your gear and everything." I was like shocked because no maths teachers ever rung my house before, and I was like real shocked. But yeah, she just wants us to be up there and be on task with our mathematics and stuff. I had a test the next day. This was Thursday. I rang her at 5:30 in the evening and asked her if she could meet me in the morning to help me, and she said yes, because I'd missed out on Tuesday's class.
When my husband picked up the phone and this girl wanted to talk to me, is it okay for Mrs. Kurana to come early morning before the staff briefing to give me a lesson because I really want to do well in the test? I could not have believed that they would ask for help like this from me. These were the students who were saying to me in the beginning of the year that they didn't like the subject, and for them actually to want to do well, that itself was a big turning point. She actually took her test paper home from me. She wanted to show it to her mom. "Mrs. Kurana, I have never ever got marks like this in mathematics." They didn't have any belief in themselves.
She's someone that wants to learn our culture, and she wants to teach us something from her, so we're getting something back from each other kind of thing, so we really interact well.
My mate's in this class because she's the best teacher in the whole school, because she actually makes us learn.
When we first known her, we didn't really know her that well, but something about her is just the way she teaches us, and she's got a belief in kind of thing. She got a belief in students gaining or achieving something in mathematics, and that's what everyone likes about her.
Yeah, this class is really learning. End of last year, beginning of this year, I wasn't really getting an average grade, but now I'm getting over average, And I kind of like this class. I wish I would be in this class next year as well.
As you could see in the movie, there was some very high levels of success of implementing relationality, or relation-based pedagogy in the classroom, and you could see that the children understood what was going on and they were achieving up and as to the same standards as anybody else, as we would expect. However, the problem arose that, okay, we had a hypothesis, we tested it, we got the results. But it only worked in some classrooms, and it only worked in some schools. And I've produced a paper, I won't show you now, but I've got data to show that those schools that implemented the program with fidelity saw greater gains for Māori students than did those schools and classrooms that didn't. It's quite clear, very clear in fact, that thems that did the job properly got the results, and thems that didn't get the results. So what do you do about that? What was the point? And the point is, as Richard Elmore pointed out maybe 20, 30 years ago, I mean, as I keep saying, there's nothing new under the sun around this work. Richard Elmore was saying teachers can't really do this on their own. You can't expect teachers to do it on their own. You need, as I've talked about before, as you saw in there, Haida Wallace, the facilitator, the coach, was vital, that she was released from her teaching duties and was trained up to become an impact coach. However, what was missing was the school level support and the structural system level support. So, as you do if you're an academic, you write another book. And so I did this, I wrote this book. And it took ages to get it right. It just seemed ages and ages and ages. And as I'll show you later, I still didn't get it right, even with this book. It took 3 years to write this, which normally doesn't take you 3 years to write a book, but this one did. It took ages to get it right, because it was such a big question. How do you scale up educational reform? How do you actually change things so that it'll be sustained? It'll stay there and it becomes business as usual. Because at the moment, we've got a business as usual, which is creating a context where kids are failing. Teachers are frustrated, angry, principals are tearing their hair out. And yet, how do we change that norm to the new norm and maintain that new norm? Okay, so the book says, and here's another theoretical model, the book says from the literature you need goals. You need to actually set a goal at all levels in the education system. And what was really interesting is that when we went to schools in the early days, they had no goals about Indigenous kids and marginalised kids and stuff. They had no specificity. In fact, they didn't even disaggregate the data. They didn't know how many kids were Indigenous. They didn't know how they were doing. Some of our schools did it and they found, whoa, the non-Indigenous kids were achieving at 80%. The Indigenous kids are achieving at 20%. Wow, we didn't know about that. So they set goals. And those schools are now, I got a letter from a principal the other day that had been in the project for 15 years, and she said, we are now consistently, our Maori students have been and are now consistently achieving at 85%, achieving their external examinations. Whereas when we started, there was 25% achievement levels. So 1 in 4 to 8.5 out of 10. So from a lottery situation to a surety situation. Maori children know they can go to the school and they're going to achieve like anybody else. You need to develop a pedagogy of relationships to depth. It needs to become part of the new norm of practice. To do that, you need to support people to do it. It doesn't take too long. People pick it up pretty darn quickly. The Anjali Karana picked it up in 2 months. She was teaching in a different way in 2 months after she was introduced to the whole approach. Some people take 12 months, some people take 2 years, some people never pick it up, which is interesting. And then that poses another challenge to us. This is an iterative process. You keep coming up with challenges and you keep solving the problems. You then need develop supportive institutions and structures and policies in the school to actually, and within the education system, so that things will be supported. So if people, you need to cut down on the number of meetings that teachers go to, the curriculum focused, etc., and you need to increase the numbers of meetings they go to where they're using educational data for formative purposes, for example. So you don't put more work on top of people, you change the norms of what people do. You need to develop a distributed and instructional leadership. You need to move leadership away from organisational administration through to what's called pedagogic leadership or instructional leadership, where people, and we know from meta-analyses again, that the closer leadership is to student outcomes, the greater student outcomes is. So you get people, for example, senior teachers are supporting junior teachers. What was good about that vignette that I talked about, the primary school, the elementary school, that teacher was so successful because she was surrounded by a group of people who were making sure that she was successful. Whereas the secondary school teacher was on her own because all the senior people in the school were too busy doing administration to help her. She had to make it up herself. It's like the doctor who has to get the first appendectomy. They don't do it on their own. They do it in a cohort of support. You also need to spread the reform to include others, and this includes community members, it includes families, it includes all those other people that are involved. All the people in the classroom, all the schools, all the teachers. You need evidence of the progress of the thing for summative purposes, because you've got to be able to report on this stuff. But you need to, for formative purposes, of course, where do we go from here? Those purposes. And above all, you need evidence of ownership. That basically the whole aim of the exercise is to transfer ownership from the originators of it through to the schools. I'm going to show you another short video in a minute where this took place. I'll just see what's... Oh yeah, and what happens when you do this, when you implement this particular approach, is you get these results. And you can see there, NCEA stands for National Certificate of Educational Achievement, which is the external examination system. We've got 3 levels of it there. And you can see there that the top figure in each category are the schools that we worked with in the 5th phase of the project. And what characterised this phase of the project as opposed to the earlier phases was that we started off with the leadership on that model, the Gapilseo model, G-P-I-L-S-E-O. We said you've got to get goals to this, your pedagogy's got this, for institutions got to be like da-da-da-da, and so on and so forth. So we worked with them. In fact, the facilitators went and did the work with the teachers, and I took the school principals and did the work with the school principals and introduced the project, their area of the work with them, as it were. And you can see there that at all levels, even to the last one, all levels you've got the children who are in the project schools are doing much better than children in comparison group schools. Can you see that? Level 1, 10.8 to 4%, 14.7, 4.8, 10.8, 3.4. So these are basically Maori students in the project schools were gaining at 3 times the rate of Maori students in non-project schools. And so therefore in the project schools we had teachers implementing relational pedagogies in the classroom, and we had principals and school leaders supporting them through implementing the Gapilseo model in the schools. And that was phase 5. Okay? So I'm going to show you a short video now of Te Puke High School, of where that was implemented in the 2010, 11, 12. And then at the end of that, unfortunately, I'm going to say, however, there is another problem that arises. And the next problem that arises is that of a bifurcation. People thought that the teachers did that and the principals did that. It wasn't my intention, but that's what happened. So we then had to develop something else. Drives you nuts. Goes on. Okay. Now, you think you get it right, don't you? You think you get it right after 15 years, but you don't.
Te Kotahitanga started in 2007, and I came in as a new principal in 2007, so that was an exciting thing to come in for. In the first year we had our first 30 in the first cohort, and in the second year we had all staff involved. So I think we were in a really good position by 2008 to have had all staff involved in Te Kotahitanga, and we've used that as our umbrella for our professional learning since then.
We want to make it more sustainable so that it's not just the facilitation team that's going in and observing the teachers and supporting them. We'd like it to be embedded in all the professional learning groups.
Student voice in the maths department. Steve is using students working at the whiteboard, and he's taking a little video clip of them, putting it onto staff resources, and it's linked, and we've got a hyperlink into the unit that we're specifically doing. So it could be integers, say, and then there's got a 3 or 4 second little clip of the kids actually physically teaching. It's really, really valuable.
I suppose it's been through our discussions with other schools, making that connection between the Te Kotahitanga facilitation team and the senior leadership team, and really then having a look at how we can make sure that Te Kotahitanga is part of all of our practice.
This is how it fits with Te Kotahitanga. And helping
We're talking about getting this spread across the school. These meetings we actually make it quite overt in terms of what we're looking at, in terms of the Kapulsio model, and making sure that that's what we're using to review our practices, looking at that evidence, what do we need to do to improve, that continual improvement of what we're doing.
And that's a real focus now, to get teachers to bring as much evidence as they can, and I mean hard evidence. Not just talk about it. We accepted a bit of that before, but that's not enough now. We need hard evidence, hard data, so that they can see themselves what they're doing, so that they can show it to others and they can use that data to then move forward. So that's a real focus.
So our meetings with the Te Kotahitanga team will actually focus in around that, looking at what's it saying about our Maori students in terms of their learning and achievement. Each senior leader develops their own objectives, and then they set their targets to meet for that objective, and then they report against that to the Board of Trustees on a monthly basis.
It's not only that, I mean, it's like you coming into my class, you know, we've done that for a long time, but it always brings me back to that reflective practice.
Middle managers are critical because they're in a position to affect most change. And so by providing, I think, a greater emphasis on professional learning, and that they actually are pedagogical leaders, so there's a shift in terms of their position away from what traditionally would have been a management type position. I think also with the professional learning that we've put into place, that teachers can see that all of the initiatives are actually aligned under the Te Kotahitanga umbrella.
That's allowed them to be able to share with others and have that acknowledged. Previously, I don't know how we acknowledged good teachers. You identify a teacher as doing something really well, and other teachers will go and say to them at the COCOM meeting, can I come and watch that? Or can I look at that evidence?
I think one of the important changes that's taken place with Te Kotahitanga within the school is that breaking down of the barriers between classrooms. And I think the teachers are becoming a lot more comfortable about people moving in and out of their spaces that they're teaching in, and so that they're sharing their ideas a lot more. I think they're open to new ideas, and I think it's really a healthy environment to be in.
What we developed was practices and examination of theories for teachers, and we'd called that the effective teaching profile. There was a profile of effective teachers, and we'd supported them to implement that, and we'd got data to show that the closer you got to implementing that, the more successful your children were in the classroom. We then also developed what leaders did, and they became, as Alan Little was saying in the movie, we developed pedagogic leadership, instructional leadership, and we developed systemic leadership in the schools, and so on. What I said though was the problem with that. Okay, that's when Te Kotahitanga finished, 2012. The government said, right, you've had enough money, that's it. A number of schools have carried on with it under their own steam, but there have been other programs that have come out and have changed the direction and so on. I was then approached, I retired from university about that time too, and then I was approached by another group, a professional development company in Auckland, and they said, would you like to carry on developing this stuff? And I thought, yeah, well, the big problem that I've identified at the end of phase 5 was that there was this sort of artificial bifurcation, this dichotomy had been created, where teachers did this and leaders did that, and other leaders did that. And I sort of thought, no, I never meant that. Excuse me, I put my hand up, excuse me, I didn't mean that, I meant something else. And so I had an opportunity to develop something further. And then I actually reiterated that relationships are actually fundamental at all levels in the education system. Why would it just be in the classroom? And so we try to emphasise that the relationship between students and teachers should be the same as that between teachers and impact coaches. And that between impact coaches and middle management leaders and teachers should be the same as that between teachers and students. And between principals and teachers and students and families, it should be the same. The same sorts of things should be going on. In other words, there should be a relational component, an interactive component, and a monitoring component to see how well you're going. So, instead it's like this. The first part of the profile would be that all people, no matter who they are, where they are, should be creating an extended family-like context for learning. For whomever you are working with, your job is to create this context where people can bring who they are into the interaction, where they can feel official, where they can feel acknowledged, where they can be understood, and so on and so on. And within that context, they can interact in ways that we know promote learning. So why should teachers be told what to do and yet students be offered the opportunity to co-construct learning? So why get weird about this? Why not have the same level? And then also the third part of it is that people, all learners, should be able to monitor, or should be able to monitor learners' progress by using their voice, knowing, in John Hattie's terms, knowing your impact. And knowing what impact you're having, using data for formative purposes, will enable you to then see how well you are creating a context for learning and how well the interaction is taking place and what you need to tweak, how you need to change it, etc. And of course, you don't do this on your own. You do this as a collective, because on your own it's very difficult, but as a collective it becomes the new norm. So the relationship-based teachers and leaders, or leaders of learning profile, I've called it latterly, because this is what people are actually, as leaders of learning. They're not administrators. They're not principals or, heads of departments or syndicate leaders. They're leaders of learning. Teachers are leaders of learning, and students are leaders of learning. So, what does each one of these come to? And I just happen to have a copy for each of you of this, okay? And it's even got a picture of me on the back. I mean, what more do you want? It's also got a photograph of my friend on the front. I don't know how come that got there. But Lorraine Tuffer is the leader of this project for this company, Cognition in Auckland. And I've got a lovely job with them. I've got the all care and no responsibility. She does the work and I do the talking. Ooh, at last I've got the right job. I used to do all the work and all the talking. I was exhausted. Here we go. What's creating an extended family context for learning? What do you do to it? And all of these things are verbs. I've put everything in verbs because everything is an active doing, and it's something that you can observe. You can see people doing these things, and so therefore you can give people feedback on how well they're doing it. And you can also observe yourself on how well you're doing it. So for example, anti-deficit thinking. And I've put in there the Maori word for kaue whakaiti. Don't put people down. Whakaiti means to put people down, so that the theory resonates with Maori people. See, remember I started that off, it's got to resonate with the people with whom you're working. And if it doesn't resonate with them, then they won't participate. So anti-deficit thinking, we'll be looking for that. We'll be looking for our people on a daily basis demonstrating they care for the children. We talked to people and said, this is really important. Kids told us how important it was that you demonstrate on a daily basis that you care for them. One really good example, a teacher told us that she had a class one day, and in the class was a young Maori boy who had his head down and wasn't participating. And it wasn't fetal alcohol effects. It wasn't. She didn't know what it was. And so she quietly went up to him and got down to his level and said, "What's up? You're normally pretty..." he was normally very vocal in the classroom, and normally he was an ace participant. She was a really good teacher, this person. She was a very relational-based teacher. But she said, what was interesting is the boy then said, "Oh, you didn't say good morning to me this morning. And I thought I was in trouble." That's all it was. And she said, "Oh God, how embarrassing." Because my first response was a deficit response. I thought there was something wrong with him. There was something wrong at home, that I had to fix that up. But it wasn't. It was a relational problem. I just hadn't said to them. Normally, what she would do is that she'd greet them at the door as they came in and said, "Hey, nice to see you, saw you at the weekend," so on. But this time she goes and she just, because she was busy trying to get ready for the next class, she said, "I just blew it." And then my theorising blew it as well, my explaining of how come it was, and luckily she went and spoke to him. And she said, no, you're not on problems, I've been busy. He said, "Oh, thank goodness." Oh, thank goodness. And on went the lesson. Having high expectations. Do people demonstrate on a daily basis they have high expectations for children? It's just so important. Kids told us that when they write a sentence, the teacher says good boy, good girl. When the Pākehā, the European kid, writes a paragraph, they say good boy, good girl. So the expectation for us is low. They know that. The people with whom you're working are not dumb. They are highly sophisticated consumers of education. Managing learning effectively, Kotahitanga, is about knowing how to do things. And then knowing what needs to be learned, mohiotanga, knowing what needs to be learned. How many elementary school teachers don't know how to teach math, don't know what the content of maths is? Because they're the victims of this stuff themselves. They're the victims of low expectations. A lot of them are women, and women have had a tough time in primary school education. And we all know this. We don't have to rehearse this too much. What's the second part? Within that context, when you can create an extended family-like context for learning by implementing those 5 dimensions, they're all measurable, observable, and feedbackable, and feed-forwardable. You then can interact within that learning context by drawing upon learners' prior learning, by using formative assessment, feedback, feed-forward, by using co-construction processes and using power-sharing strategies. Not stand at the front and deliver, etc., etc. And once you've got that sorted, you can then monitor learners' progress and the impact of the processes of learning by assessing how well learners are able to use evidence of current performance to determine future practices. Can they set goals? How well can learners set goals for their learning? So you think about this. Students can set goals. Can they set goals? Maybe they can't. Okay, need to be shown how to do it. One of the key criteria for a self-managing learner, self-directing learner, is being able to set goals. If we don't teach them how to do it, then they won't learn how to do it. Or they might, but it might. Let's get it scientific about it. Some people can do this, some people can't. Let's make it so that all can. Let's take the secret out of this and just share the way of doing things. Can they articulate how they prefer to learn? Students that I've spoken to can, very clearly. They can tell exactly how they like to learn. Do they know what to do? How to do it? Can they explain how they prefer to be organised? Can they participate in leadership roles and functions? Can they include others in the learning context and interactions? Can they provide evidence of how well they're progressing and what progress they're making? And then the key, can they take ownership of their own learning? I'll give you this out, and I'll just leave you to have a read through it, and you'll see that it's actually better than my PowerPoint. It's actually got, on the front, with Lorraine's photograph, it's got a summary, which I've just run over there. And then on the inside, it's got details of what each one looks like. So, for example, dimension number 1 is rejecting leaders of learning create a family-like context for learning by 1, rejecting deficit explanations for learners' learning. And then, which means that, and there are 4 dimensions of that particular part, and which means that deficit explanations are not used to explain learners' difficulties. In other words, you don't say, oh, they can't do this because they're dumb, or their parents didn't teach them, or this, they're up too late last night, or something like that. The reason why they can't do it, I saw a fantastic teacher once who said to the kids in maths, there are 3 levels, you probably know this already, that there are 3 levels of work in this class. There's easy, medium and hard. And if you have difficulty with something, it's because it's hard or it's medium. And it's meant to be difficult. Somebody says, I can't do this. Oh, well, that's because it's a difficult level of work, that's why. So the kids go away, oh, right, okay. Oh, it's meant to be difficult. It's not meant to be easy. It's the difficult part. There's nothing wrong with me. Can you do difficult work? Yeah, sure, when I'm shown how. So you immediately get away from that terrible, oh God, I can't do maths business that so many people have. Agentic talk is clearly articulated and learners are encouraged as they succeed. Errors and mistakes are seen as being opportunities to learn, not insurmountable problems. How often do we overlook that one? There's an opportunity. Somebody makes a mistake, you say, good. I had some wonderful people who were doing some research with Maori learners once, and I was trying to show them how to do collaborative storying. Jean Clandon and Michael Connolly developed this approach in Canada here. And one of my students came to me and said, I'm losing control of my research. I said, great. That means you're really starting to work with the people now, because they're starting to take control of the research. She didn't believe me, but she got there in the end. Learners' language, culture and heritage are seen as assets and not as hindrances to learning. Often we treat culture as an object and in fact we get teachers to teach about Indigenous cultures. Well, I always say the most authoritative person who's most knowledgeable about the culture of the average adolescent Indigenous people is in fact your average adolescent Indigenous person. They know most of what it's like to be that person. And your average non-Maori, 91% of our teachers are non-Maori, your average non-Maori person should not be expected to know about Maori culture. In fact, if they do learn about Maori culture and they get it wrong, they'll get a growling, as Maori people will. What they need to learn about is how to teach maths and science and stuff properly. But they need to be able to create a context where they are responsive to the children's culture, where the children are able to bring their culture into the conversation that is learning, where they will actually be able to interact in such a way that their sense-making processes, the way they make sense of the world, is brought into the interaction. And that's by creating a family-like context, by interacting within that and monitoring to seeing how well you go. So you create, you interact and you monitor. Create, interact, monitor. So what I'm suggesting is that we'll address educational inequalities, which is what we started off talking about, when the first thing we need to do is to find and develop theories that resonate with marginalised people's lives and understandings, that make sense to people with whom you're working. If you have a theory that's based upon deficiencies, no one's going to buy into that. If you've got a theory that says Indigenous cultures are inappropriate, shouldn't be in schools, you're in trouble. Likewise, if you've got a theory that says, well, the way to solve all this is we're going to have cultural practices, etc., etc. We're going to take kids out of maths class and they're going to do Hogan building and stuff. You're likewise going to have some problems. We're going to address educational inequalities when there's a common code of practice, like doctors, like lawyers. My daughter's a lawyer and she knows what she has to do. It's not dumbing her down, it's not demeaning, it's a common code of practice and they have to stick to it. Otherwise they get growled at from the judge. She spends her days in courtrooms and she knows what to do and how to do it. She doesn't have to make it up herself, which is what we expect of teachers. Our teacher education institutions are appalling at this. The one I used to work at had 7 different departments with 7 curriculum areas, and each of them had its own learning theory. And the people that had to make sense of that were the students. How could they make sense of all that? I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't make any sense to me, and I've been in the game for 40 years. So what's that all about? It's about provider capture, not about client-focused or student-focused education. When practice is evidence-based and serves formative and summative practice purposes, we'll start to approach and address educational inequalities. When students' voice is central, as is dialogue, rather than teachers' voice being central, students' voice. And when the student's voice is central and it is dialogic and the interactions are dialogic, then we'll start to address educational interactions, achievement, inequalities. When culture is seen as sense-making, not as something to be learnt about or another part of the curriculum or something like that. You know, Ray Barnhardt's got a good model, an iceberg. 90% of the iceberg is beneath the water, you can't see it. That's the sense-making part of cultures. The top of the iceberg, the 10%, is what you can see. And what we tend to do in schools now is think of culture as the top 10%, whereas really it's about the 90%. And as I said again, the best people to understand that 90% are those participants in that culture. What's the job of the educator is to create a context wherein that people can bring what they understand of the world, how they make sense of the world, as opposed to the objects that we tend to think of as culture. And where leading learning focuses on improving students' outcomes. That's what we're on about. And you want to summarise? The whole thing's summarised in this book and that. And it's called Freeing Ourselves. It's about taking over, taking control of what's wrong and saying, let's sort it out from an Indigenous point of view. So I'll just say thank you very much for listening and being so attentive. Hope it's been useful. I would dearly like a bit more time, but maybe we'll get another opportunity at another time. Kia ora tata.